Good morning, and welcome to this Sunday service. We are live streaming from the sanctuary of the Eno River Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and I just have to say, it is not the same without you. We miss you. We wish you could be here with us. There are 10 of us here this morning live streaming because we are in phase 2 of ERUUF's modified reopening plan, and that's what we're doing to help slow the spread of COVID and keep each other safe. I'm Reverend Deborah Kerr, and whoever you are, wherever you come from, whatever your race, your gender, whomever you love, and wherever you are on your spiritual journey, welcome here this morning. If you're new to this community, and especially if you are visiting today, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Say hello. People will say hello back. You can find information about us there if you haven't found it on our website already. And we'd be so happy to help you learn more about us, if that's something you'd like. As I said, we are in phase 2 of a limited reopening plan. All our programs and groups are online. ERUUF groups are able to use outside space if you go through the office and make a reservation, and if your group members agree to the rules of use. Again, that's how we're keeping each other safe. So see our website for important details about how to do that. So here's some exciting news. Beginning this Thursday, our campus becomes an early voting site for the Durham County Board of Elections. In 2016, we were the second busiest site in Durham County, and we are so curious to see what's going to happen and how that's going to go this year. We're confident that it will go well, and we're so pleased to be supporting voting rights in North Carolina this way. This is part of our values as a congregation. So, yes, let me just see. After the service, everyone is invited to come to a virtual coffee hour to connect with each other in small groups, to visit a little bit, chat. Come and go as you please. There's no requirement that you stay. It's up to you how long. You can just pop in for as short a time or as long a time as you wish. There are people to talk to. It's one way to keep connected. You can access it later in the service. There'll be information about how to get there on a slide, and you can also find that information on the ERUUF homepage at the end of the service. So today's worship team includes myself and also Reverend Jacqueline Brett, who will be participating at a distance this morning. Reverend Stacy Grove joins Kate Lewis to provide the morning music. Pam DeLavore is our cantor this morning. Our tech team includes Jenny Jolly, Michelle Sager, and Sean Trimble, and Scott Gaskins is our soundboard guru. So let's just all take a deep breath. Feel the goodness of the air in your lungs as it supports you. As we center ourselves, we take another breath and let it out. And we continue our service this morning with the prelude. hear these opening words. These were prepared by Reverend Jacqueline Brett, and she had inspiration from a colleague in Alberta, Canada, whose name I do not know. A prayer of this place. So I invite you to join me in the spirit of meditation and prayer as we situate ourselves and we honor this native land. Hush. This is a holy place, a sacred place where visions dwell, where the dreaming began. Someone's God has stepped here, dwelt here, spoken here of life, of death, of holy things. As we come softly, walk softly, talk softly, be mindful of the dreams. Hush. This is a holy place, a sacred place, where the visions dwell, where the dreaming begins. This is a place where trees and bushes, grasses and ferns, deer and chipmunks, robins and bluebirds have lived and died for generations. When the young have been born, cared for, and nurtured, when death has overtaken life age after age. Hush. This is a holy place, a sacred place, a place where visions dwell, where dreaming begins. This soil, the Piedmont of North Carolina, is where the gods have lived, the gods of the Ino, the Occaneechi, the African slave, and the freedman, where our Unitarian Universalist ancestors made promises of love and kindness and broke their promises in deeply disappointing ways, where dreams turned into nightmares, yet where hope still kindles. Hush. This is a holy place, a sacred place, where visions dwell, where the dreaming begins. This is holy ground, made holy by our presence, our love, our struggle. Come, let us walk softly, talk softly, and let us stomp our feet. Let us shout. Let each utterance remind us of the dreams that live and the hope that is this place. We light our chalice this morning, the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist faith, a beacon that ever helps us find our way to love and to truth, especially in troubling times. Our first hymn this morning is "We Stand on Holy Ground." It's
We stand on holy ground. We stand on holy ground.
The United States Poet Laureate Joe Harjo writes, "Each human is a complex, contradictory story. Some stories within us have been unfolding for years. Others are trembling with fresh life as they peek above the horizon. Each is a zigzag of emotional design and ancestral architecture. All the stories in the earth's mind are connected." It is with such stories in mind that today we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. On the UUA website, you could read this, that it says, "Indigenous Peoples Day reimagines Columbus Day and changes a celebration of colonialism into an opportunity to reveal historical truths about the genocide and oppression of Indigenous peoples in the Americas, to organize against current injustices, and to celebrate Indigenous resistance." The idea of replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day was born in 1977 at a UN conference in Geneva, Switzerland. The topic was, it was a UN-sponsored conference, and the topic was discrimination against Indigenous peoples in the Americas. 14 years later, activists in Berkeley, California, convinced the Berkeley City Council to declare October 12th a day of solidarity with Indigenous people. Henceforth, there has been a growing movement to appropriate Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day, and many states have changed the holiday's name, including North Carolina. And throughout the service this morning, we are going to offer the poetry and the words of the current United States Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo, of the Mvskoke Creek Nation, the first Native person to be honored and celebrated in this way. And finally, a word about language. We have learned through the writings of Indigenous activist and historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz that, quote, "Indigenous individuals and peoples of North America on the whole do not consider Indian to be a slur. The language Indigenous, Indian, and Native are often used interchangeably. What all citizens of Native nations much prefer is that their nation's names in their own language be used, such as Diné for Navajo or Anishinaabe for Ojibwe, and so on." And so this morning we begin with a reflection from Julia Marrone, who was of, I practiced this and I'm going to get it wrong, I apologize. She is of Cherokee heritage. I can't say it without slaughtering it, so I'm not going to do that. Forgive me. This is Julia Marrone speaking of her heritage.
My mom raised my siblings and I with Indigenous traditions before I even knew that's what she was doing. Truly, it took moving away and living on my own to remember and realize just how big of a role the traditions played in my life and how the cultural consequences of the assimilation practices personally affected my mom. I am now proud to boast about my Cherokee lineage and my great-great-grandfather, Frank Wiley, that grew up on a Cherokee territory in Oklahoma, but this hasn't always been the case. When I was in elementary school, we were instructed to check out a book a week from our school library beginning in kindergarten, and it was our homework for the class to read the books by ourselves or with a parent's help. To differentiate instruction, certain kiddos were only allowed to select chapter books, and I was one of those students by first grade. At 6 years old, I checked out Dear America's Across the Wide and Lonesome Prairie, the Oregon Trail Diary of Hattie Campbell. This story wasn't necessarily intended to be hateful towards Indigenous people, but it also wasn't very nice. My mom cherishes our Cherokee lineage, even though we are now a few generations removed, and reading this book with her when I was just 6 years old was one of the most transformative and awakening experiences because she sat down with me chapter by chapter and explained just how bad the perceptions of Indigenous people were at the time of this story. My mom knew that the story that I would learn in school about Indigenous people was one of hatred, and she was determined to teach me the truth. When we got to passages such as, "I made a friend, she is 14, 1 year older than I am, with freckles over her nose and cheeks and beautiful green eyes. She is not as bossy as Becky. Matter of fact, she seems real shy. But I think I shall like her very much anyhow. When I told her I am scared of Indians, she said, "Don't worry, Hattie. There are probably plenty more good Indians than bad." My mom made sure to take a pause here. She asked me why anyone would ever be afraid of us just because we had freckles or dark eyes. Of course, I didn't know the answer, but she did. Growing up in a small conservative town right next to economically and racially diverse Atlantic City, New Jersey, meant that my childhood was riddled with structural racism. My entire family works in the service industry to support the wealthy travelers that make up our local economy. I worked in the service industry for 6 years myself, 3 of those before I graduated high school. We never fit in with the families of the children I went to school with that had lawyers, teachers, and police officers as their parents, but I was lucky that the children didn't know any better for the majority of my childhood. It wasn't until I was a teenager that they too began realizing that my family didn't fit their mold. But it was funny and ironic because even though they knew something was different, they still made it a point to tell me on a regular basis that I was too white to self-identify as Native American, even though I am still within the legal definition that would allow me to claim it with the tribe. Reconnecting with my own spirituality through my time at ERUUF, which is my first true spiritual home, has allowed me to reconnect with parts of myself that I haven't been able to express. People don't believe me when I tell them how much I can code switch on a daily basis, but my coworkers who are of color are well aware. The assimilation practices were aimed to eliminate an entire people by breeding out the bloodline or forcing white culture so intensely that our families lost themselves, their stories, and their traditions. I'm only just beginning, but I intend to ensure that I am not only relearning my rich culture that I was raised with, but also preserving it the best that I can with my own family. Thank you.
I'm listening. I am listening. Spirit, speak to me. I'm listening. I am listening. Spirit, speak to me. My ears are wide open. My eyes are now open to see what I may be. I'm listening. I am listening. Spirit, speak to me. I'm listening. I am listening. In this moment of Spirit, speak through me. I can hear the voices of all my kind. I'm listening, singing. I am listening, this tweeting and howling into the wind. My ears are wide open, and oh, the joy. My eyes are wide open, oh, the love to see that's here for you and me. Oh, I'm listening in this moment of silence. I am listening. I hear Spirit speak through me.
Our first reading this morning is by Joy Harjo. It's called "For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth in Its Human Feet." I was struck in this reading by the interconnected nature of all of life that comes through so clearly in her language and in her images. Put down that bag of potato chips, that white bread, that bottle of pop. Turn off that cell phone, computer, remote control. Open the door and then close it behind you. Take a breath offered by friendly winds. They travel the earth, giving essences to plants to clean. Give it back with gratitude. If you sing, it will give your spirit lift to fly to the stars and beyond and back. Acknowledge this earth who has cared for you since you were a dream, planting itself precisely within your parents' desire. Let your moccasin feet take you to the encampment of the guardians who have known you before time, who will be there after time. They sit before the fire that has been there without time. Let the earth stabilize your post-colonial jitters. Be respectful of the small insects, birds, and animal people who will accompany you. Ask their forgiveness for harm we humans have brought upon them. Don't worry. The heart knows the way, though there be many high-rises, interstates, checkpoints, armed soldiers, massacres, wars, and those who will despise you because they despise themselves. The journey might take you an hour, a day, a year, a few years, 100, 1,000, even more. Watch your mind. Without training, it might run away and leave your heart for the immense human feast set by the thieves of time. Do not hold regrets. When you find your way to the circle, to the fire kept burning by the keepers of your soul, you will be welcomed. You must clean yourself with cedar, with sage, or other healing plant. Cut the ties you have to failure and shame. Let go the pain you are holding in your mind, your shoulders, your heart, all the way to your feet. Let go the pain of your ancestors to make way for those who are heading in our direction. Ask for forgiveness. Call upon the help of those who love you. These helpers take many forms: animal, element, bird, angel, saint, stone, or ancestor. Call your spirit back. It may be caught in corners and creases of shame, judgment, and human abuse. You must call in a way that your spirit will want to return. Speak to it as you would to a beloved child. Welcome your spirit back from its wandering. It may return in pieces, in tatters. Gather them together. They will be happy to be found after being lost for so long. Your spirit will need to sleep a while after it is bathed and given clean clothes. Now you can have a party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place else to go. Make a giveaway. And remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark. I invite you to join me in spoken prayer and meditation. The first part of this is Joy Harjo's poem, the Eagle Poem. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot know except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born, and die soon within a circle, a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning inside of us. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. And so, friends, this morning we open our hearts, swept clean by the circular motion of our breath in and out. And as we breathe, we feel love arise in the boundless spaciousness between breaths. And we rest in a love which is within us, among us, beyond us, a love which supports us as our breath supports us. And let's pause for a few moments to rest in that boundless love. This morning in our community, we hold in our hearts Brian Pohl, father of Maggie Pohl, husband of Jaylene Bauer-Smith. Brian died recently after a long illness. We hold Scott Gaskin's sister Susan, who has tested positive for COVID-19 with mild symptoms. Carol Ann Antunes and Diane Blount as they support Carol Ann's daughter, Jean, who is struggling with a brain tumor. Susan Spitzer, who was recently hospitalized. And we rejoice with Laura Grillo that her husband, Henri, is recovering from a long illness. This morning we hold all who are ill in body, mind, or spirit, all who struggle, all who mourn. We hold all who rejoice and are glad. We hold in our hearts all who fight for fairness and justice, one phone call, one new voter registration, one poll observer at a time. This morning we hold our loved ones near and far. May they be happy and may they be well. May all people, all living beings be happy and well. When we pause and consider and truly appreciate the world, the eagles and all other things, we know, as the poet tells us, we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. And so we breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe out, knowing we are truly blessed to be born and live and die within this sacred circle of life and love. Ashe. Amen. May it be so.
Good morning, friends. I'm sorry that I'm unable to be with you from the sanctuary this morning, but I woke up with a sore throat and some sniffles, and in keeping with our COVID guidelines, I have chosen to remain at home in order to not only take care of myself, but also to consider the needs of my colleagues at ERUUF. So I love this time of year, even on the days like today when it's kind of gray and rainy. Fall has always been my favorite season, usually on most days for the golden beauty of the light and also the bounty of the harvest. I love walking into a grocery store this time of year and seeing pumpkins piled high, bins of sweet potatoes and yams, multicolored gourds, squash of all kinds, piles of apples, and the appearance of winter greens like collards and mustards and kale. One of the unexpected gifts I discovered when we moved to North Carolina 17 years ago was the beauty of the leaves changing this time of year. When we lived in Brooklyn, I had grown accustomed to taking long drives to New England or upstate New York to witness the gorgeous beauty of the leaves changing. When we moved here, I'd assumed we were giving that up, only to discover with great delight that we had not. In fact, we did not need to drive for hours to see the leaves changing because we now lived amid their beauty. And so 17 years ago, I was quite excited around this time about celebrating my first Thanksgiving holiday here for all the reasons I named above, the beauty of the season and the delights of the harvest. And I also just love to prepare big family dinners. In North Carolina, we now lived in a spacious home that would accommodate all of our local as well as our out-of-town family who were coming for dinner. This was my family's favorite holiday, and it still is, even more so than Christmas or birthdays, because the primary gift you need to bring at Thanksgiving was yourself and a good appetite. As with many other families, ours is a communal gathering in which everyone participates in the meal preparations in some way. You either make a dish, you set the table. We also have a ritual, which is my favorite part of everything. Right before our meal, we stand together in a large circle, and each person, young and old, take a brief moment to place into the circle a few words of thanks for something good that year, no matter how difficult the year had been for any one of us personally or for all of us collectively. We understood there was always something to be grateful for, even if it was simply gratitude for that moment when we were all together. Then after we ate, we all hung out in our food coma and watched whatever major sport was on television or movie that was suited for all generations. So I was in the throes of making my preparations and imagining how wonderful this first Thanksgiving in North Carolina would be when I received an email from a very creative young woman I knew who still lived in Brooklyn. Excited to hear from her, I opened the email to discover an image of huge balloons of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade covered by a red circle with a diagonal slash running through it, the universal no sign. The image was accompanied by an article about why we needed to not celebrate mourning for Native American people in the United States. Let me correct that, for Native people in the United States. My jaw dropped and I froze as I read this article. I then sighed deeply and sat back in my chair, staring at the computer screen for a long moment, my mind swirling. So I wish I could tell you that I called up all my family members and canceled our Thanksgiving celebrations. I did not. What I knew was that our celebrations were an opportunity to be in gratitude for and with family. And over the years, our Thanksgiving holidays had become joyous hybrid affairs that often included immigrant in-laws and friends from Cuba and Belize, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Puerto Rico. None of us gave a thought to pilgrims or Indians, as this article accused. I hate to admit it, but I was annoyed with my young friend. What was she thinking, ruining my holiday by sending this to me just a couple of days before Thanksgiving? Why couldn't she have sent it several weeks before so that I could have had time to process it and figure out what to do? At least that's what I told myself. I shook my head and pushed the email and the thoughts it evoked to a corner of my mind, figuring I'd look into it later. And I went on with my plans. My family and I had a wonderful Thanksgiving gathering that first year in North Carolina, one that we still talk about today. And I must confess that I thought no more of this day of mourning until the next year, when that same young friend sent the same email to me again. I wasn't as annoyed this time, though I realized that I had not given a thought to what I now knew was a national day of mourning for Indigenous peoples of the United States. I sat a little longer with the article this time and sifted through my thoughts. I suddenly realized that what I'd been taught in school about this holiday had been utterly ridiculous. And I then went on with my plans, thinking no more of this. Until the third year, when the same friend sent the same article yet again. She was obviously trying to get my attention. I never heard from her during the rest of the year, only this article. I wanted to know what was up, so I finally gave her a call and we spoke. She told me things that I simply did not know and had not considered. I hadn't a thought about Native peoples, and that, she helped me to see, was a great part of the issue. I did not see them, nor did I think about them, except in the most general way. Though at the point of first contact with Europeans, it is estimated that more than 15 million Indigenous people lived on the landmass we now call North America. However, by 1845, Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in his journal of a people who were generally regarded as defunct. He wrote, "We in Massachusetts see the Indians only as a picturesque antiquity. Massachusetts, Shawmut, Samoset, Squantum, Nantasset, Narragansett, Assabet, Mvskoke, but where are the men?" And in 1867, historian Francis Parkman declared, "The Indians melted away, not because civilization destroyed them, but because their own ferocity and intractable indolence made it impossible that they should exist in its presence." Wow. Millions of people supposedly just melting away. When I read things like this, I always suspect there's got to be more to the story. Writer Gerald Weisner of Anishinaabe heritage and an enrolled member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe White Earth Reservation tells us, "You can't understand the world without telling a story. There isn't any center of the world, but a story." And in his narrative, The Truth About Stories, Native writer Thomas King says, "The truth about stories is that that's all we are." But I find myself asking, and beloveds, I'm inviting you to also ask, whose story? During this brief time together this morning, I invite you to listen a little more deeply to several key aspects of a story of a particular sort, the myth of our origins as a nation, and how those myths have impacted our relations with Native peoples of the United States and our understanding of who they are, and by extension, who we all are. Historian and longtime activist in the international Indigenous movement, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes, under the crust of the portion of earth called the United States of America, from California to the Gulf Stream waters, are interred the bones, villages, fields, and sacred objects of American Indians. They cry out for their stories to be heard through their descendants who carry the memories of how the country was founded and how it came to be as it is today. Dunbar Ortiz, author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, suggests that we begin with the most essential story that any group of people holds about itself, its origin story. The story that a group of people shares about how it all began, the myth of how they came to be. And all groups of people have stories like this. For those of us who grew up and were educated here in the United States, the most familiar origin story begins in the 15th century, around 1492, when Christopher Columbus discovered America. Then in the early 17th century, when settlers arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, and a decade or two later, when the Pilgrims and Puritans arrived in Massachusetts. Some of you might recall Plymouth Rock from grade school history and the harvest feast we now know as Thanksgiving, shared between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people, though perhaps you, like I, only knew of this latter group as the Indians, because no one had mentioned that they were a specific group of people with a name. Embedded in these three stories, and believe me, we have many of these stories, but we'll focus on these three, are the myths of America's origins and three key ideas that are important for us to unpack. Important because these seemingly benign foundational stories about settlers and colonists are fraught with devastating meaning. And we must listen more deeply to the embedded meanings they contain, because they can guide us in an understanding of the unconscious meaning making we're enmeshed in today. First, undergirding these stories was a European law known as the Doctrine of Discovery, based on a 15th century papal bull, that's an edict from the Pope, that essentially said that indigenous inhabitants lost their natural right to their land as soon as Europeans arrived and claimed it. Specifically, non-Christian lands. People's homelands were discovered by European foreigners, and the people were considered subjects automatically of the Europeans and were expected to do what the discoverers wanted. If they resisted, they were to be conquered by European military action. For instance, in 1609, Mvskoke, leader of the Powhatan Confederacy, an alliance of 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes, asks John Smith, the military leader of the Jamestown colony in Virginia, why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? What is the cause of your jealousy? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants. If you will come in a friendly manner and not with swords and guns as to invade an enemy. Smith had threatened to kill all the women and children if the Powhatan leaders would not feed and clothe the settlers, as well as provide them with land and labor. So you might recognize John Smith from the story of Pocahontas, another origin myth. Mvskoke was her father. So while the English The Pilgrims and Puritans were not Catholics or subjects of the Pope. They believed they had a covenant with God which gave them too a right to subject the people and take their land. Ultimately, all Europeans believed that by virtue of being white and Christian, they were superior to the indigenous peoples they encountered anywhere in the world. Most of the non-European world was colonized under this doctrine of discovery from the mid-15th century well into the 20th century. Dunbar Ortiz writes, Europeans and Euro-American discoverers had gained real property rights in the lands of indigenous peoples by merely planting a flag. She goes on to say, the doctrine of discovery is so taken for granted that it is rarely mentioned in historical or legal texts published in the Americas. A second idea embedded in our stories is that of the settler, people who traveled from faraway Europe to make their home here. It sounds reasonable enough, making a home, perhaps fleeing persecution from somewhere. But as Dunbar Ortiz points out, the word settler means more than just a person who settles down to live in a new place. Throughout history, it has also meant a person who goes to live where supposedly no one has lived before. However, more often than not, settlers have gone to live somewhere that is already a home to someone else. A third idea embedded in all our stories is the notion of colonization. Colonization is all about taking political and economic control of a region. The colonizers are the people or institutions that are part of that process, whether it's the military, business interests, people who go there to live, and often representatives of religious institutions. This latter group should come as no surprise because the doctrine of discovery was legitimized by Christian religious leaders. Dunbar Ortiz contends that because of their key role in establishing and populating a colony, settlers may be called colonizers. And the goal of settler colonialism is to take over all resources in a region, particularly the land. Settlers who came to what is currently known as North America wanted land for homes, farms, and businesses that they could not have in their home countries. So under their nation's flags, those Europeans fought native peoples for control of that land. Settler colonialism was key to the building of the United States. And finally, embedded in these stories is the notion of manifest destiny, a term that many of us did learn about at one time or another in our American history classes. Manifest destiny is basically the belief that English-speaking white Americans were destined to spread their presence and their ideals across the entire North American continent. Manifest destiny became the banner under which homelands of indigenous peoples would be taken by the US government. So that was a lot. And I invite us to take a pause and consider these things. Let us also take a deep breath. And so, whether it is the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, settlers, or colonists, a few moments of deep listening and critical thinking begins to dislodge the origin myths as we've come to know them. And for the social scientists among us, there is also the notion of civilization and who decides what civilization is, and how such definitions shape what we think about societies and the people in them. As you and I listen more deeply, we have an opportunity to see Indigenous peoples with new eyes, to reflect upon their story as they know it. Today in the United States, there are more than 500 federally recognized Indigenous nations composed of nearly 3 million people, the descendants of the 15 million original inhabitants of this land. Dunbar Ortiz reminds us that these people carry memories and stories of their own about how the United States came to be the nation we know today. It is necessary, she says, that Americans learn to think more completely and more critically about their own history, because it can help them be better citizens of the world. So I was pleased to learn that in 2012, the UUA General Assembly passed a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery and calling for the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My young friend no longer sends me the Thanksgiving email as I came to regard it. She succeeded in making me more awake to how certain American myths are alive in me too. And so I'm committed to dislodging and dismantling these myths within myself. My family and I still celebrate a time of gratitude together on the last Thursday in November. But I now hold this time in a new context, and with conscious respect that it is also a day of great sorrow and mourning among the Indigenous people of this land. I hope you will too. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.
This is the time in our service when we pause to consider how we are called to give of ourselves, how we want to help create the larger story that we are all in together. What story are we going to help weave into reality? Unitarian Universalists are committed to add something of ourself, our love, our care, to support the interdependent, interconnected web of life, and also the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We look for ways to give of our time, our talent, and our treasure, even during this stay-at-home time. It's a time when we can think deeply about these things. So we contemplate this now, and you can take action if that's right for you by making a contribution through our website or in your own preferred way of giving. We give thanks for all the gifts that support and sustain this beloved community, that help us co-create a new story here among ourselves and also in the larger community of which we are a part.
Today's close are one of my favorite poems written by Joy Harjo. It's called Remember. And she writes, "Remember the sky you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn, that it is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life will all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origins of this universe. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance that language is, that life is. Remember. Go in peace, my friends. Go in love. And may your life be a blessing.